Háiste sa gine cór. An gédal sias fircin fóilse roimh go léir agus tá óthasam go bhfuil an cógáil se díirithe rud anna hábhachtach an ceangal idir cuasaí ocrais, cuasaí cathatha agus cuasaí ceartas roide. Tóniste, dear friends, I'm very pleased that this conference highlights the connection between hunger, nutrition and climate justice. And I'm so pleased that it is taking place during the Irish presidency of the European Union. I want to thank Minister Joe Costello for his kind invitation to open, and I thank you for the very warm welcome from behalf of my wife and myself. I opened in the oldest, our own language, the Irish language, respecting as I do all of your languages, and for all of you who have come from different parts of the world in different cultures, I'm so pleased that you are here. I'm pleased to note that this symposium is not only an official event of the Irish presidency, as I've said, but that it is an important event jointly organised by the Department and the Mary Robinson Foundation Climate Justice, and in cooperation too with the World Food Programme and the Climate and Food Security Centre. I'm aware that a strong focus will be placed, and I'm so pleased about this, on ensuring that those most affected by the impacts of climate change in developing countries will be heard. And as President of Ireland, Maruk Dránahéireann, I welcome in particular those delegates from Latin America, Africa and Asia who have travelled to share their experiences, their knowledge and their skills with us. And my hope is that this meeting in Dublin will produce such an emancipatory approach to what are urgent problems as will transform and deepen the debate on hunger, nutrition and climate justice and the connection between them. Global hunger in the 21st century represents the grossest of human rights violations, and it is the greatest ethical challenge facing the global community. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, which I visited earlier this year in Rome, while the world at the present time produces enough food to potentially feed its entire population, more than 1 billion people are undernourished, over 2 billion suffer from nutritional deficiencies, and almost 6 million children die every year from malnutrition or related diseases. The source of this hunger is not a lack of food, but the moral affront of poverty created and sustained by gross inequalities across our world, inequalities of power, economics, and technology. And while we have witnessed some significant and very welcome gains in poverty alleviation in the past 2 decades, notably in countries such as Brazil and India, there are far too many living in extreme deprivation, condemned to lives of powerlessness and relentless hardship. The majority of those suffering from hunger and malnutrition are landless people. They are smallholders. Many are women and girls living in rural areas without access to production resources. Now, although many people might imagine that deaths from hunger generally occur in times of famine and conflict, the fact is that only about 10% of these deaths that I mention are the result of armed conflicts, natural catastrophes, or exceptional climatic conditions. The other 90% are victims of long-term, chronic lack of access to adequate food, which represents, I repeat, the greatest ethical failure of the current global system. This food insecurity is, of course, in violation, we must realize, of the substantial international law which underpins the right to food, a right that was recognized in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, enshrined in the 1966 International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And that stated, the right to food is realized when every man, woman and child, alone or in community with others, has physical and economic access to adequate food or means for its procurement. At the Rome Declaration on World Food Security in 1996, Ireland joined other nations in reaffirming its commitment to ensure the right to food is realized at the global level. And subsequently, the United Nations Economic and Social Council produced General Comment 12 on the right to adequate food, and that was in 1999. The comment sets out the necessary steps that were to be taken by states and civil society to respect, protect, facilitate, and fulfill the right to food. These commitments and the right to food guidelines of 2004 obliged states to take preventative and proactive steps to ensure that adequate food is available and accessible to all those in their jurisdictions. In spite of these commitments and obligations, hunger and food insecurity are on the increase. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, the three central reasons behind this increase are the neglect of smallholder agriculture, the global economic recession, and the significant increase in food prices, which has placed food out of reach of so many of the world's poor. The goal, of course, is not just that. It is to produce, not just to produce more food, but to ensure that each child has access to adequate nutrition, to a sustainable diet that will allow each child to grow and thrive and to reach their full potential in life. We now have, of course, high-level political commitment and leadership from the United Nations Secretary General through the Zero Hunger Challenge and through the Scaling Up Nutrition movement. And it is crucial that we build on that political commitment. But the compelling reality is that proper nutrition makes a contribution to simultaneously meeting several of the Millennium Development Goals, most prominently in the vital areas of improving maternal health, reducing and minimizing child mortality, and in getting children into and through the formal education process. But no area, however, more succinctly raises the moral question: can words be translated into actions? After all, when commitments are betrayed in the name of interests, be they national or global, the hungry and poor of the world are smitten twice, the second time by bad faith. Climate change presents another complex layer of challenges onto those that I have mentioned. Challenges to the nutrition imperative. Extreme climate events, ever more frequent, undermine the ability of many of the world's poorest people to earn a decent living sufficient to secure a sustainable diet of sufficient nutritional quality. Michael Jacobs, in a recent article in the Social Europe Journal, quotes the World Bank, which warned recently that the present emission trends will lead to global warming of at least 4 degrees centigrade by the middle of the century, triggering what he called a cascade of cataclysmic changes, including more frequent weather-related disasters, declining global food stocks, and sea level rise that will affect hundreds of millions of people. And he quotes the Stern report, which suggested that even leaving aside the human cost in an appeal to self-interest, the economic losses caused by such events would be equivalent in this century to the cost of the 2 world wars and the Great Depression of another century. But the crisis is much wider than this. An index of the prices of 33 commodities, ranging from iron and ore, copper and aluminium, to soybeans, coffee and cotton, from 1900 to 2010, shows a remarkable phenomenon. For 100 years, commodity prices fell on average by 1.2% per year, a reduction over the century of 70%. But in the last 10 years, that entire 100-year fall in prices has been wiped out. There is by a surge in prices that is twice as great as the surge in prices that occurred during the Second World War. So climate change is not an abstract phenomenon, featuring in arcane science journals, measured only in laboratories. It is present everywhere in its consequences, and perhaps most harshly and adversely in environments where people are least equipped to meet its force and its ill effects, and incidentally, the people who are the least responsible for its causes. According to the United Nations Human Development Report of 2011, countries with low human development indices have contributed the least to global climate change, but they have experienced and are experiencing the greatest loss in rainfall and the greatest increase in its variability, with implications for agricultural production and livelihoods and any efforts at poverty reduction. And even as we speak, the least fortunate on the planet are already bearing the brunt of past emissions, and our generation, in some senses, bears a heavier responsibility than earlier generations. Why? We, unlike those who went before us, cannot say that we did not know the consequences. If present consumption patterns, for example, in our shared vulnerable planet, if they continue, 2/3 of the world's population will live in water-stressed conditions by 2025. And 3.5 planet Earths would be needed to sustain a global population if we were to mimic the current lifestyle of the average European or North American. It is projected that world food production will need to increase in the order of 60% to 70% by 2050 if we are to meet the needs of that year's world population of 9 billion people. Yet the overall impact of climate change will see an increase in extreme weather events in vulnerable areas of the world. Food security will increasingly rely on agricultural systems already at great risk of adverse change and exposed as a result to lower yields. So what type of response might ensure the right to food and promote sustainable, equitable development? If we are to stand in solidarity with the world's poor and ensure that they have access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food, a number of fundamental issues, I believe, must be confronted. One of the most difficult challenges facing policymakers is to achieve a sustainable solution that takes account of the water, food, and energy relationship with each other and their connectedness. Within this relationship are changing patterns of landholding and acquisition, including the diversion of land use from food production to fuel provision. The lack of any supranational regulating or monitoring mechanism for land acquisitions has enabled the acreage of transnational land acquisitions to rise from 15 to 20 million hectares in 2009 to more than 70 million in 2012. And Africa is the prime target for these deals, with sub-Saharan Africa accounting for 2/3 of the acreage. The World Water Assessment Programme tells us that poorly regulated foreign investments in lands that could otherwise be used to feed local populations could potentially have devastating consequences on the fragile state of domestic food security. And according to the International Land Coalition, corrupt practices, behind-the-door negotiations, illegal evictions of traditional landowners, and violence against community are all common features of the current phenomenon of large-scale land acquisitions. Where such interventions are in pursuit of production of biofuels, they have, in many cases, caused deforestation, threatened biodiversity, increased food prices, and decreased food stock. The International Monetary Fund estimates that the rise in demand for biofuels accounted for 70% of the hike in maize prices and 40% of the rise in the price for soybeans between 2006 and 2008. The conclusion there is that the current pace of land acquisitions and the related concessions of water rights to investors also carries great threats, existing and potential, for transboundary cooperation in many river systems, including those of the Nile, the Niger, and the Senegal basins. We must recognize then that the particular vulnerability of smallholder farmers, pastoralists, and fishing communities is immense. Faced with shrinking productive resources, they are on the front line of shocks and extreme weather events which are having a direct impact on their livelihoods and food and nutrition security. What is urgently required is a robust regulatory framework which protects our fragile and threatened environment and which respects the right of smallholders to remain on their land and retain access to water sources. Such regulation needs to be developed as well in a collaborative way and transparently, involving practitioners from developing countries, such as many of you who are here today, and which is respectful of and responsive to their lived experiences. We also need, of course, to urgently address how we transform and transcend the unjust nature of women's experience. Equal access to productive resources must be guaranteed for women. They comprise the majority of smallholder farmers in so many developing countries. And control of resources such as land and credit is vital, as is their influence in decision making. This will mean developing new programs and policies that are responsive to women's realities and their needs as carers and breadwinners. I very much agree with the Special Rapporteur on the right to food, Olivier de Schutter, who I'm glad to see is at this conference, who has said, food security strategies should be judged on their ability to challenge gender roles and to truly empower women. Gender sensitivity is important, but it is not a substitute for empowerment. The United Nations Special Rapporteur has called on states to implement as well multi-year transformative food security strategies that promote full equality for women by working to redistribute traditional gender roles and responsibilities. Now, while there are many still who continue to advocate for such as the De Soto model on land tenure, which proposes using land as collateral for private bank loans, I must state that that model is, I believe, a source of dispossession of women farmers of their fields and livelihoods, and the enrichment of private banks at the expense of state credit and microcredit systems. So there are structural issues within global financial arrangements too, which need to be addressed. The Irish public, perhaps due to historical experience of famine at the end of the middle of the 19th century, always responds generously and gives a lead to appeals for those afflicted by hunger and undernutrition. Yet, I must draw attention to a striking paradox in global consciousness. On the one hand, famine and deprivation can move not only the Irish community, but the global community to deep compassion and to elicit some generous responses. But on the other hand, international trade and finance arrangements, which undermine small landholders in the developing countries and threaten their livelihoods, persists and is accepted very often uncritically. Such arrangements continue in spite of decades of discussion and advocacy on these unsustainable and unequal arrangements. The global community has not yet engaged this contradiction between their compassionate instincts and the structures of narrow interests they choose to support through silent indifference or even collusion. And speculation in food commodities is a dramatic illustration of this contradiction. Such speculation has contributed to dramatic price increases for basic foodstuffs across the developing world. Professor Howard Stein of the University of Michigan has demonstrated, for instance, that while in the 1990s only 12% of the wheat futures market was held by speculators, this had grown in 2011 to 61%. The result, says Professor Stein, was a steep rise in food prices, which more than doubled between June 2003 and June 2008. The impact on food consumers in poor African countries is stark. In a survey of 58 developing countries, food prices were up by 56% between 2007 and 2010, placing millions more at risk of malnutrition and hunger. And further, capital is increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few corporations in the food sector, as ActionAid International reported in 2005. 5 companies control 90% of the world's grain trade. 6 companies control nearly 80% of the world's pesticide market. 3 companies control 85% of the world's tea market. 2 companies control 50% of the world's trade in bananas, and 3 companies control almost 80% of the confectionery market. So these are stark illustrations of a contradiction between a moral instinct and the practical arrangements by which our global community lives. Contradictions, I hope, that your conference will address. And while the efforts now being attempted to put in place through the G20 on agriculture markets information system, which will provide transparency in key commodity markets, and that is welcome, a practical intervention. The moral and ethical issues of speculation in foodstuffs, even during times of famine, remains to confront us. We must not lose either the opportunity, I suggest then, to put the stamp of our shared humanity and our shared vulnerability on all of these challenges. The institutional and structural reforms that are necessary are now more urgent than ever. There are, of course, too, acknowledged issues of uneven and price-distorting agricultural subsidies in all their complexity, and issues of technology transfer and dependency, which I have no doubt will come in for discussion over the next 2 days. Mar focal scéir chun críocha Carlish and Méad Atá. To conclude, Ireland, through the government's development programme Irish Aid, and through the work of so many NGOs community to which I pay tribute, has been working assiduously to improve the awareness of these interlinkages and outcomes in human and economic development. And this, I hope, is in line with an emerging, I would hope that I am right, an emerging global consensus among informed and concerned scholars and practitioners. This trend stresses the need for an integrated and comprehensive approach to addressing food security and nutrition, security and the right to food, through linking agriculture, food security and nutrition interventions and climate change. I am so pleased that Ireland's European Union presidency reflects quite properly the political imperative to place hunger and undernutrition at the centre of our efforts. This will be sustained not only until 2015, when the timescale for the Millennium Development Goals concludes, but afterwards, when a new set of successor global goals, which I hope reflects your views, will emerge from discussions and consultations now underway internationally, but which must be informed by the practical experience of those who are suffering from climate change. And the results of this valuable conference and your deliberations will, I am sure, inform and shape this post-2015 framework for global justice. Every success and blessing on all of your discussions and their succeeding efforts. I am delighted and honoured to formally open this conference, and I so wish you well in every deliberation. Garamila Mahagi, thank you.